there, I'm Caitlin Bandy, and this is my channel, Bandy's Books. Today is Tag Tuesday, and I am super excited to get into the tag we're doing today. That is the Fab Four tag. It is an original tag created by Tom LA Books. And if you don't follow Tom, you really should. His channel is fantastic. He is such a detail-oriented person. When he's talking about books, you can just see the passion and the fire that he has for literature and for reading. And he takes subjects that to me seem incredibly daunting and breaks them down in a way that they're understandable for the average reader. I think I've mentioned before on this channel, I know at least I did in my Booktube newbie tag, I don't have any sort of a background in literature. I don't have a degree in English or anything like that. I'm a chef for a living. I have an associate's in culinary arts, and I do have a little bit of college in terms of some business and language and things like that, but I never went and got a full degree. And so oftentimes I find myself approaching like classics, complex literary concepts and things like that, and it's been so long since I've studied it that I'm just like, what is this person talking about? And I actually have to like go Google and kind of refresh. And Tom does this wonderful thing with his channel where he talks about things that are, you know, high-end literary concepts and complex books and things that are very intimidating, but he makes them so relatable and so understandable and so easy to follow. And his personality is so great. He just comes through as like the friendliest, most genuine person when he's talking. And I really, really highly recommend his channel. And he's so close to 1,000. I think he's at 920-ish subscribers. So if by chance you're watching my channel, which is obviously much smaller, and you don't already follow him, go give him a follow. He's worth it, and let's help him hit that 1,000 subscriber count. So let's get into it. So this tag he created was one that I got tagged in a couple weeks back, I think about 3 weeks now. And I was taking my time getting to it because there's a lot of questions in this tag that really made me think. I have my prompts and answers kind of typed out on my laptop here, just because, you know, like I said, it was a little bit more research than I usually put into my tag videos, and I wanted to make sure we could keep everything straight. So prompt one, so each prompt is a quote from a Beatle or Beatle adjacent person, and then a prompt about the book below it. So prompt one is, I just fell out of bed, found out what key I had dreamed it in, and I played it, Paul McCartney, about yesterday. And the prompt is, a book that you dreamed about or that inspired one of your dreams. So this was an easy one for me. I'm sure that I've mentioned this at least once on this channel before, but probably one of the most inspirational figures in my life was Anthony Bourdain. I read Kitchen Confidential when I was younger. I've wanted to be a chef since I was a little kid. I think when I was about 11, I decided that I wanted to be a chef. And so I was very lucky that I had a lot of supportive people in my family. And somewhere along the line, my mom gave me the book Kitchen Confidential. And that for me was this solidification in my goals and my dreams. I read that book and I went, these are my people. These kitchen folk, these travelers, these are my people. And it made me so resolved to not just cook, but to travel the world. At the time that I read it, I had a goal of getting out and traveling, but I had never been anywhere outside of the US or Mexico. So never off the North American continent. And I knew I wanted to travel, but I didn't know anything about it. So I kind of squirreled away that feeling of that book. I squirreled away that feeling like I was seen and understood, and I went about my culinary education. I graduated high school early. I went into college as soon as I was 18 because my parents wouldn't let me move away before. And I graduated with, you know, really good grades. I scored a really good job right away when I was in culinary school. I think like 3 weeks in, one of the chefs in one of my classes recommended me to a chef friend of hers. I ended up working as a line cook in a Wolfgang Puck restaurant, working my ass off. I was working 60, 70 hours a week, plus going to school 20 to 25 hours a week on top of it. So I have like 2 years of life that were just kind of a blur through all of that. And I kept going back to Kitchen Confidential as it being like, I'm working towards this goal. I'm working towards being this person. I'm working towards this found family feeling of kitchen folk and the ability to travel and see the world someday. And so for the first 10 years post-graduate, I worked really, really hard, saved my money, did everything I could. I traveled a little bit. I did start taking like one trip a year. My mom and I went to France, partner and I went to Japan, my parents and I and a partner went to Italy and Switzerland. And I started that travel, but it was like, I felt like there was a lot missing still. So a couple years later, in 2018, I just turned 29. I had lost my grandmother and my grandfather within 2 weeks of each other. And I'd done most of their hospice care, my mom and I. I'm the only grandchild, my mom's the only child, so it's just the two of us to do all of that. And in that moment, I thought about, okay, I've spent the last decade of my life working as hard as I could possibly work, dedicated to my craft, doing everything I can to get ahead. And I did. I was an executive chef by 23. By the time that I was turning 30, I had almost a decade of experience running restaurants, not just working in them, but running them. And I felt like the part that was missing still was the travel. So I quit my job. I had a really good job at the time. I was the head of a culinary department for a historic mission in California. Good benefits, nice environment, all that kind of stuff. And I took a really big risk. I quit my job. I took all my savings, a little bit of money that I inherited from my grandparents, and I paid off everything that I could pay off, put all my stuff in storage, and took off on a trip around the world. I traveled for about 2 years, and I was able to see 20 countries. So that brought my total up to about 25. And I also got to take a 3-month road trip from Las Vegas all the way to Alaska, around Alaska for a month, and then back. And for me, I kept coming back to Kitchen Confidential throughout that. And Anthony Bourdain, not just Kitchen Confidential, but that's kind of where it starts. I kept coming back to, this is it. This was this dream that this book put words to for me. This was the culmination for me of this thing that this book touched in me somewhere. And I finally got to do it and live that dream that this book inspired. And since coming back, I'm back working in the culinary industry now. I'm in a great job where I have really good work-life balance, time to go out and do things. But it's still in the back of my mind. Every 10 years, I want to be able to quit and take a year or two and travel and see the world. I want to see every country in the world. And it also inspired my philosophy with how I approach travel, because I go into countries now with an open mind, with, no perception. And I try to let the local people dictate my experience. I try very, very hard. It's impossible, obviously, not to have a tourist experience when you're a tourist somewhere. But I try very hard to be open to whatever comes in my journey, wherever I am. I try to not foment super serious plans. I try to just drop myself somewhere and figure it out. And I've had some of the best experiences because of that. And I think all of that, or not all of that, because I think those things innately existed in me long before I read Kitchen Confidential. But I think that Kitchen Confidential gave me the words for it, the confidence to understand it, the feeling of not being alone in those desires. All that kind of came from those words in that book. Prompt 2, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, John Legend. A book that talks about drugs, or that was written under the influence of drugs. So this book is one that I think qualifies on both of those. It's about drugs, and I think it was also written under the influence of drugs, if I remember correctly. And that's Requiem for a Dream by Hubert, Selby Jr. So I actually saw the movie of this before I read the book. And for me, I saw it when I was very young. I was at a summer camp. I think I was 15. I was working there as a camp counselor. We were on a break, and all the other counselors were a little older. So we were in the break room, and somebody put this movie on. And as an adult, obviously, I recognized that it was clearly not appropriate for someone my age to watch. But sometimes I feel like those things that happen to us that are maybe not necessarily age appropriate really leave a mark on us. And for me, that particular movie and the book, which I read later as an adult, was so haunting. It's just so seared into my memory so vividly. It's about 3 different friends who are heroin dealers and their subsequent addictions and how it affects their life. And I can't really discuss it too much without it getting into a really spoilery realm, but it is just tragic, incredibly tragic and haunting. And I mean, I was in that generation of kids that grew up with DARE, you know, the anti-drug campaign, and I think that this particular book did way more for me in terms of staying away from drugs than any of the anti-drug programs that I went through when I was a kid. Maybe that this book should be required reading in like high school, you know, because it paints such real consequences to drug use. And yeah, it's a pretty remarkable book in that way. Brutal, difficult, traumatic, but effective. So that would be my book about drugs. And then prompt 3. We thought we'd be really big in Liverpool, Ringo Starr. A book about someone who had far more success than what they expected, or a book that was much more successful than what the author expected. So this was an easy one for me. I recently read The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon a couple months ago. This is the first book in a series. I believe the series is going to be somewhere between 5 to 7 books long, if I remember correctly. I think 4 are published so far. This was the debut of this author, so she decided to debut with, you know, this massive epic series, and she was really surprised by her success. I found a quote from her where she said, "I'm just really overwhelmed and humbled by the reaction. I didn't expect my first novel to get this big, and I'm so grateful for the support." I personally think that this book should be bigger than it is. I do follow book social media, both Bookstagram and Booktube, and I only occasionally see this on there compared to like A Court of Thorns and Roses and Twilight and things like that, where I'm just like, how are these books so incredibly famous and then a well-written series like this is not as well known? But it's still been very, very popular, still done really, really well. I'm just always going to be, you know, putting this out there as, if you like fantasy, sci-fi, dystopia, this is a series you should jump into. 4. Sitting on a Cornflake Waiting for the Van to Come, John Lennon. A surreal book, or a book with some surreal element that you enjoyed. So this was one of those ones that caught me a little bit, because I was like, I remember the term surrealism from school, from English class in high school, but in terms of how to apply it to a book, I was kind of struggling. I'm like, I don't think I've ever read anything that was surrealist. So I did a lot of, you know, Googling, researching, and then came up with some things that I think fit. I have both a few books that I've read and also a book that I'm going to be reading that's like on my physical TBR at the moment. Some books that I've enjoyed that fit into surrealism would be The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. This is surrealism designed for a child. I mean, obviously adults read it and find joy in it as well, but I really love this. This is one of my all-time favorite books, and I don't know why, but I didn't really think of it as surrealism. I guess I thought of it as like fantasy, and so when I was looking through surrealism and its definition, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that this fits in there. So there's one. Also, Enchanted by Renee Denfeld. This is my French copy. Both of these are in French. And this book is about death row and an inmate on death row, but it's written in a way where there's a lot of surrealist elements to describe realistic things. And so this was another one that I think really fit this prompt pretty well. And then also a book that came up that I didn't realize was surrealist at all, because I haven't read it yet, but I found quite a bit on lists recommending surrealist books, was Welcome to the Night Vale. This is a book that I picked up at a secondhand bookstore a while back. It is one where I was just really attracted by the cover, honestly. Like, I found it really interesting, and then when you open it up, the inside pages are kind of really cool too. So the appeal of the book was just, like I said, that it was a very interesting looking book. I started reading into it, and I found out that this book was actually based on a podcast. This particular book is a story about a desert community in the American Southwest. There's some sort of a mystery going on, and it was inspired by this particular podcast. I talked to a lady at the bookstore about it. I picked it up and I was like, hey, have you read this? What do you know about it? And she's like, oh, that's so amazing. You have to take it. And I didn't really know actually what it was. Like, I thought maybe it was just a summary of the podcast or the history of the podcast, but it's actually like a fictional story based off of this podcast, and it incorporates surrealist elements. So I'm looking forward to reading this one soon. I'm not sure exactly when, because I do theme out my TBRs each month. So the next 2 months, this won't fit into the prompt, but hopefully maybe in April, I'll be getting to this one. Prompt 5, The White Album. A book that you loved that A, has a minimalist cover, or B, is written in a minimalist style. So this was another one I wasn't super sure about. Like, I know what minimalism is in terms of aesthetics. So I assume that minimalism in terms of aesthetics applies to, books as well. Maybe not a ton of description, more straightforward, shorter word count, things like that. And then obviously a minimalist cover, is going to be a design where there's not a lot going on. So not crazy graphics and bright colors and all that. More, simple. Kind of made me think of like 1984, the covers that came with that. I think those qualify as minimalism because, there's just one simple design and then a flat color, not like a whole bunch of stuff all over the place. But I didn't want to go with that because I figured that was going to be probably the common answer. So another book that I thought about that is on my wish list, but I haven't picked up yet, is No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. And this particular book has a cover that is very haunting, and it's actually what kind of caught my attention initially. I was scrolling through books. I do that periodically. Like, I'll go to different websites and just scroll through books and see what catches my eye and then read the description. And if it sounds interesting, I'll add it. I have a couple different wish lists, and I'll add it to a wish list of books that I think I might want to read. So this particular book, it has a bright cover, and then it's just like kind of a ghostly or alien figure of a person and the title. And that's it. And it's very haunting. It kind of reminds me of this episode of Goosebumps that I saw when I was a kid. There was some characters in it that kind of looked just like this cover, and it haunted my dreams when I was a child for a couple weeks. So yeah, that was the minimalist cover that really caught my attention, something that really drew me to it, something that I'm hoping that I'll be reading soon. Oh, this is the perfect day for this. It's raining outside right now, which is a nice treat. We weren't supposed to have any rain today or this week at all. And it's so dry here in Vegas, and like, it's just so beautiful, the rain. That's why I'm still in my pajamas. Usually by this time of day, I am up and dressed and going about my day. But I just wanted to sit here and enjoy the rain and my tea and chat about books. Anyways, back to the prompts. Number 6, Little Darling, It's Been a Long, Cold, Lonely Winter. Here Comes the Sun by George Harrison. A book of poetry that you found uplifting. This was probably the toughest prompt for me because I don't read a lot of poetry. I shouldn't say that I don't read a lot of poetry, but I don't read a lot of like complete books of poetry. And I should read more, but it's one of those things that I just, for whatever reason, haven't really done a lot of work on. There's other genres that I've worked on, and poetry is one that I am woefully lacking in. So instead of telling you about a book of poetry that was revolutionary for me or uplifting, I am going to tell you about a book of poetry that I would like to read that came out last year, I believe. And that was Call Us What We Carry by Amanda Gorman. So Amanda Gorman is the young lady that spoke at Joe Biden's inauguration. She was stunning, and she did this spoken word poetry, and it was mesmerizing. She's truly, truly a talent, and she's receiving all this well-deserved recognition right now. So she published a book called Call Us What We Carry recently, and it's a book of poetry, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. The cover is gorgeous, and I have a feeling that the message inside of it's going to be very, very poignant as well. So I'm thinking next month I'm doing a whole TBR focused on Black History Month, so I may be including it next month. And I think because I don't read poetry a lot, I'm going to do a reading vlog around it to kind of talk about my experience reading it and how I felt about reading poetry and the message and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that, maybe. Prompt 7, A Day in the Life, an experimental book that's very uncommon for its content or format, and yet it works well. Oh, this was another one that was tricky because it's like everything's been done so much. I just recently read a book that was in the epistolary format, and that for me was a little bit new, but not something I'm unfamiliar with and not something I had never heard of before. So trying to think of something that was very like unique or uncommon was a little difficult. I stared at my bookshelves for quite a long time trying to come up with something, and then it hit me. So I read in Spanish and in English, and I love Julio Cortazar. I have several of his books on my shelf right now. And one that I remember being, and it's been a while since I read it, but being very unique was Hopscotch. And the reason that it's unique is because it can be read in any order. You can definitely read it chronologically as it's written, and it tells a specific story of an Argentinian gentleman. He's living in Paris with his mistress. Their child dies, the mistress disappears, and then he returns to Argentina where he takes on several different jobs. He works as a keeper of circus cats, a salesman, and what was the other one? Oh, and in an insane asylum. And it's just this it's kind of surreal in some ways, and it's very unique because you can read it in the order of the chapters, but you can also mix it up. You can start anywhere in the book and read it in any order that you like, and it still makes sense, and it still has, you know, a narrative style that flows and everything. So that's very, very unique. I haven't seen too many stories that are non-linear in that way. I mean, I've certainly read non-linear stories where, you know, it flashes forward and back and here and there, but it's still written in a specific order, even though it's a non-linear order. This is literally a book where you can kind of take it wherever you want, and it still is a cohesive story. So I really appreciated that one. If you haven't read Julio Cortazar, I really, really recommend it. If you do speak Spanish, I recommend reading it in Spanish because that's the language it's written in initially, but his translations are fantastic as well. So don't let it stop you, of course. And then prompt 8. Over half of Americans who are 45 and older attribute the Beatles' split to Yoko Ono. A book about a woman, or if you can't think of one, a man who is unjustly blamed or accused of something. So there are tons of books out there about women who are unjustly accused of something. I can think of quite a few about women that were burned to death or crushed to death in the Salem witch trials. And many other things, women that were locked away in insane asylums because of hysteria. Girl Interrupted comes to mind. All sorts of different stuff. But I have a book that's on my TBR that I will be reading next month for Black History Month that seemed kind of relevant. We just had Martin Luther King Day yesterday, so I thought that this was a good topic to kind of put into this video. And that's An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. This book follows a married couple, and they're newlyweds, and shortly after marriage, the husband is accused of a crime that he did not commit. And this book follows the effects of that accusation on their marriage and life. So this book, like I said, heavily centers on wrongly accused of a crime. And unfortunately in the United States, that is an incredibly common phenomenon. Black men in particular being accused of crimes that they did not commit. We're seeing this frequently where, death row inmates who have been in prison for years and years and years and had their lives robbed from them are being given justice. Their convictions are overturned on DNA evidence, on recanting of testimonies, things like that. And you can never give somebody back their life after you've convicted them of a crime wrongly. You can't repair 30 years of missed time spent in jail and the damage it did to family, and not seeing children grow up, and not having a normal relationship with your spouse or your parents, not being there when your parents pass away, stuff like that. So that prompt in particular really made me think about that a lot. That sadly common phenomenon here that needs to be less common. I think if we're gonna convict people of crimes and throw them in jail, we need to make sure that the evidence that we're basing those convictions on is irrefutable. And I know that as technology changes and gets better and better, there's less of a window for that to happen, but it still happens at an alarming rate. So that's my book for this prompt. Prompt 9. Limitless, undying love which shines around me like a million suns and calls me on and on across the universe. John Lennon. A book that opened your mind and made you think of the universe in a new way, either physically or spiritually. So I have 2 books that fit this entry. One was more of a spiritual experience for me, and one was both physical and spiritual and very mental. So the first book in that is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This particular book is a book that focuses on nature and botany. I mean, it focuses on a lot of other things as well, but that's the most prevalent theme, I suppose, is nature and botany. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist, and she has indigenous roots. And she talks about her experience getting into botany and in college, where everything's very by the book, right? There's defined rules, and you're getting an education based on these defined rules. And her experience as a Native woman doesn't fit within these academic rules, I guess. So there's lots of times where she's talking about, for example, why this blue flower grows next to this purple flower and how they benefit and coexist with each other. And she sees this relationship between these 2 plants, and she brings it up with her professors, and they kind of push her away. They're like, oh, that's not academic, that's not quantifiable, that's not a valid concern. There's a part where she's talking about sweetgrass and harvesting the sweetgrass, and how in certain areas sweetgrass is dying off and in other areas sweetgrass is thriving. And she's talking about the relationship between the sweetgrass and the native indigenous communities that are harvesting it for basket weaving and whatnot. And she has a student who's writing her thesis on it. And when the thesis topic is presented to the board that has to approve the thesis topic, they're very negative about it. They're like, oh, this isn't valid. Everybody knows that, tampering with nature doesn't benefit it. And they actually find out it's quite the converse. In the areas where indigenous communities are harvesting sweetgrass, the sweetgrass is thriving. And in the areas where sweetgrass is left to its own, it's dying off. So it's created this kind of a symbiotic relationship between the indigenous communities and the sweetgrass. And there's many, many other things that they go into. She talks about lakes and algae blooms and how, an overabundance of ducks and geese and their feces create, this toxic algae and make a lake uninhabitable, and the process of restoring the lake. And she talks about areas of native land that were stolen from indigenous communities and destroyed, and the process of rehabilitating that land. There's just so many interesting topics. It's a long and dense book, but it's so worthwhile. And one of the things that I really appreciated was that it didn't just focus on the academic portion of it. It didn't just focus on research. It focused on indigenous teachings and spirituality and feeling and connection. And as somebody who's an avid hiker, I don't feel it necessarily always in the way that she described it in her book, but I feel a lot of connection to the land. When I'm out hiking, I'm in this peaceful place, and a lot of the times when I get to a peak of a mountain or a viewpoint, I'll just lay down and rest and close my eyes and meditate and just feel this unity with the nature around me and the power and the healing of the nature around me. And the way that she touches on it in the book, the way that she ties that spirituality into the academics of it is just fascinating. That was my first 5-star read of this month and of this year, and I'm so glad I started that book at the beginning of the year. It was definitely something that was monumentally inspiring and educational, and taught me a lot more about indigenous culture within the States and linguistics and all sorts of different stuff. I highly, highly recommend it. And then the second book that I was going to discuss on this prompt was The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, MD. This is a very popular book right now, and it is for a reason. This book deals with trauma, how the mind and the body are affected by trauma, and how to release the trauma. Now, there's tons and tons and tons of books that have been written on trauma. Many times over, people have explored post-traumatic stress, the effects of post-traumatic stress, the psychology of post-traumatic stress. As somebody that has had more experience in my life than I would care to have dealing with post-traumatic stress. Not me personally, but people that I love dealing with post-traumatic stress from war, abuse, things like that. This book was incredibly insightful and incredibly enlightening in the way that we perceive that trauma, how we hold on to that trauma, how that trauma continues to affect us, and how to let go of that trauma, how to move forward through that trauma, how to, reclaim our life from that trauma, I guess. And I think that this really should be a must read for everyone, period. But especially if you've been through traumatic things, if you've been through abuse, if you've been through war, if you've been a refugee, if you've been in any type of situation that's caused you a post-traumatic response, I think this should be required reading for you. It is, for me, I felt like it was a life-changing book, and I've had a few friends that have been through some particularly traumatic things that have read it as well that said it was very life-changing for them. So yeah, Braiding, Sweetgrass, and The Body Keeps Score. Highly recommend both. And number 10, finally, Mother Mary Comes to Me, Speaking Words of Wisdom, Let It Be, Paul McCartney. A book that you found very powerful and moving despite its apparent simplicity. So I'm so glad that this was a prompt in this, because I just finished this book. It's fresh in my mind, so I can talk about it. And that's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a very unique book. I almost put this on the prompt about a book that does something uncommon, because I feel like this is kind of an uncommon style of book as well. But I really felt it fit prompt 10 the best, and so that's where I decided to place it. This book is written by Ocean Vuong. Ocean Vuong is Vietnamese American, and he is a poet traditionally. This is his first book. And the way that this book is written is as a letter to his mother. It's literally starts like a letter and continues throughout like he's speaking directly to his mother. And it's just about his life, his growing up, and his family's experience. Both his mother and grandmother were refugees to America because of the Vietnam War. And it touches a lot on the trauma that refugees and immigrants deal with. I grew up in a predominantly immigrant community. My neighborhood growing up was predominantly Filipino and Vietnamese, and the city that I grew up in, San Diego, is, heavily immigrant based. It makes our community so rich and beautiful and wonderful to see all of the things that get brought into the country, coming from these different places, these different perspectives, different flavors, different languages, all these beautiful, beneficial things. But what I appreciated about this book and what it touches on is the difficulty of the experience of being an immigrant. In this particular case, because you're dealing with two women who survived war and had to do very traumatic things to get through that war, it touches on the post-traumatic stress that they have. How basically they get here, they get thrust into a community where, they're very much a minority, and they're just left. They don't speak the language. Nobody helps them. Nobody is there to translate or to make sure that they have, therapy to help them with their trauma, to help them get on their feet. It's this portrayal of this isolating experience and all of these very difficult things that come from the immigrant experience, particularly in a refugee case. And he writes about these just extraordinarily difficult topics, but in a way that is so beautiful and moving and deep and poignant. This covers so many topics. It covers linguistics. It covers, like I said, the refugee experience. It covers post-traumatic stress and trauma, mental disorders. It covers coming out. Ocean is a gay man, and he discusses, growing up, being bullied because he's perceived as gay, and it wasn't as acceptable when he was a child. It covers his experiences as a first-generation child in the United States, being kind of torn between two cultures. At home, his family still retains a lot of their Vietnamese culture, but at school, he's one of the only children that's Vietnamese in his school, and he's bullied because of it, because he's different, because he stands out, and he's not quite Vietnamese enough to be Vietnamese, but not quite American enough to be American. And you really get the sense of that struggle, that difficulty. And to me, this really touched home, because I have so many friends and my partner even, that feel that way where they've either immigrated somewhere new or they were born somewhere new as the first generation in a family, and they feel that terror. My best friend described it to me. We went home to the Philippines. I was very blessed to get to go home with my best friend to visit her family in the Philippines. And we were talking about that. You know, her Filipino family view her as American, but in America, she's viewed as Filipino. And she's like, yeah, you're kind of always torn between this world. At home, your parents have that traditional, you know, Filipino background, but then you go to school and, you know, the kids are making fun of you because you have things like squid jerky for a snack. And so I thought that he summed up a lot of things that I've heard from a lot of individuals, a lot of experiences that I've witnessed from a lot of individuals, and he put it into just the most beautiful writing ever. This is stunning. Another 5-star read for me, another one that I'm so glad that I started at the beginning of the year because it's just so moving. I know I'm going to be thinking about this well past this month, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. Very, very moving, and I really think that it's another one that should be maybe required reading in high school, like at the higher end of high school. It gives you a perspective, particularly if you don't live somewhere where there's a lot of immigration. Like if you're living in a small town, maybe in the Midwest, and you don't have a lot of access or exposure to people who have immigrated from different countries, I think this is something that really would vividly paint a picture for you of that experience and of what comes with moving to another country. And I feel like it helps us be sympathetic and empathetic to people from different places with different experiences. Incredibly good read. So those are the 10 prompts of the Fab Four Book Tag. Again, this was by Tom L.A. Books. Thank you so much, Tom, for tagging me in this one. It was very thought-provoking and made me go to some deep and different places than I usually do. So I really appreciate that. That's something that I was really hoping BookTube would do for me, is to challenge me to grow, to think about different literary concepts, to reflect on some of the education that I have in literature that maybe I haven't used in many years. And it certainly did that. So thank you again for including me. And I would like to tag a couple people. I think I'm going to tag Serene Sloth and BooksAndJams. So I will tag them in the description below. I'm also going to include a link to the original video by Tom. You should go check that out. And if you can, go Google this, or not Google, but YouTube search this particular tag, because there's tons of great BookTube channels that are doing it right now. I've seen a couple of the videos, and it's so interesting seeing everyone's different answers. So I think that's it for now. I'm Caitlin Bandy. This is Bandy's Books. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Maybe comment down below on what you thought of my picks, if you've read any of these books, or, you know, let me know a book that I missed. Maybe give me a recommendation for something that's in the surrealism genre, or a minimalist book, or maybe a book that was like revolutionary for you. I want to hear about all the books, so whatever you feel like you want to comment it. And if you're not already subscribed, maybe subscribe, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye.